For you guys to know it, I'll give it to all the others.
Yeah.
I don't know. I said there were no others.
Does anyone need a book? Y'all got the books? There's plenty up here if you need one. Well, the good news is that this is not the Isaiah class. Yeah, we survived Isaiah. On to Luke. But the challenge of Luke is that it's a long book. There's a lot of material, and a lesson book. You know, if you have a chance to look at it, the way it breaks down is essentially one lesson per session, and the book gives a good synopsis. Although it's kind of interesting if you read through the book that it's basically just a come on in. I'm sorry, Mike. No, you're all right. I'm early. It's just a synopsis of the text, so that that can be helpful. But there's just a ton of material here, and so we're not going to be able to dive deeply into everything, but we'll try to cover as much as we can. So if you at least will read the lesson, maybe look at some of the questions, that will give you it's a good place to start, so you'll be prepared when we come here. But we'll reference the book from time to time, and of course looking here at the Gospel according to Luke. So what do you know about the Gospels? Don't tell me there's 4. We know there's 4. What do you know about the Gospels?
They were written to different groups of people.
Okay, they're written to different groups of people.
And for different purposes.
For different purposes. So Matthew, who was Matthew written to? To the Jews. Okay, so why would you write a gospel to the Jews?
To convince them that he was the Messiah.
Okay, to convince them that Jesus is the Messiah. And now we referenced Matthew somewhat frequently in our study of Isaiah, because Matthew uses Isaiah to frame up how he explains who Jesus of Nazareth was. What else about the Gospels?
Three of them are very similar. One's a little different. They're called synoptic.
Okay, what are the synoptic?
Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Okay, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they're each different, but what kind of ties those together is they're They're going to do a chronology of things. How's John different?
It was written much later.
Okay, it was written later.
Emphasizes the deity.
Emphasizes the deity of Jesus. John touches on a lot of the big ideas, the big themes associated with Jesus, and that's in ways that the other three don't focus so much on. Anything else about the Gospels? Well, we're going to look at Luke, and the text that I have here on this title slide is I think a very good summary of what the Gospel of Luke is all about. And this is, I would say, a theme text for sure. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. And there's probably a good sermon right in that text. There's at least 4 points I think that I could make for a sermon. We might do that. You might hear some sermons from Luke this quarter. But it's an interesting way. It doesn't say Jesus came to seek and save the lost. It says the Son of Man. What do you think about the Son of Man? What do you know about that phrase?
Is that Daniel?
Daniel? Yeah?
I know Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man just about more than any other descriptive term.
Yeah, Jesus refers to himself that way the most out of all the different ways. And it's prominent in the Gospel of Luke.
Reflects God in the flesh.
Reflects God in the flesh. Okay, God in the flesh. That's important. God in the flesh. The incarnation is the big word that we use for that, and we'll make some points about that here in just a few minutes.
Yeah, that phrase comes from Daniel 7, and there's a huge push today from lots of people, from atheists, from Muslims, that Jesus never claimed to be the Son of God.
Yeah.
And this Son of Man, calling back to Daniel 7, which is clearly messianic in nature, is a good place to go to remind people of that.
Yeah.
He might not say the words outside of John, I am the Son of God, but he does it in other ways.
Yeah. And with somebody like that, you wonder what difference would it make had he just said
Right.
that I am that. People believe what they want to believe and don't believe what they don't want to believe. The text also says that he came. He came. So that's significant. You know, God comes here. Sometimes we'll say, that God wrote himself into the story, and that's a good way to explain it. But he did more than write himself into the story. Okay?
Came from someplace.
He came from someplace. He came here in the flesh and blood form of Jesus, and that's a point that's emphasized. If you're writing to pagans, that's really unique about Jesus, because the gods didn't behave like that. Quite a different relationship that the Creator has with people than the gods that the pagans worshipped. It says that he came to seek. He came to seek. What does that tell us?
Purpose.
Okay, his purpose? That he has a purpose. Number one, he has a purpose. That there's intent in his arrival here. His intent, his mission is to save. To save. Save from who? Save from what? We talk a lot about salvation, not nearly so much about, well, what are we saved from? Who are we saved from? And, answering the question of who and what is quite important to understand the need for salvation. You start talking to most people about salvation, and they think, well, hey, I've got a great life. What do I need? Saved from who and what? I mean, life is good. So who does he come to save? The lost. The lost. The lost. An interesting characterization of the people that he's looking for. The lost. Who could the lost be?
Anyone.
anyone. Be anyone. So we said, like Matthew, Gospel of Matthew is written mainly to Jews. That's not the case with Luke. Luke is something very different. The audience, the point, the thought in mind that Luke is conveying is we're looking beyond Israel. You remember in numbers of times in Isaiah, those of you who were in that class, that God has in mind saving the nations, saving everyone. He even tells Israel, hey, you're going to need a bigger tent because the family is getting bigger. And so the lost could be anyone. Jesus came for anyone. He came for everyone.
They have to come to know that they are lost. If
Right.
you don't know you're lost, you're fine.
Yeah, if you don't know, you're lost. Yeah. So he's going to do that. And it's interesting, though, that a lot of the people that you find Jesus having encounters with, there's a whole bunch of them who know they're lost. And that says something maybe about the kind of people we need to be looking for, and who Jesus is looking for. You deal with the establishment of the time, and they didn't think they were lost, and he has confrontations with them. But there's a lot of people who, they know they're lost, they know they're empty, and they're drawn to Jesus. So Luke 19:10, it's a great theme text, looking at the big picture of what this is about. So as you probably already know, the Gospel of Luke has a companion book. What's the companion book? Acts. I wonder why it wasn't Second Luke. We've got First and Second in the Old and New Testaments, but not here with Luke and Acts. But they're companion books and are often studied together. So, we wonder who wrote Luke, Acts. Thinking about both of those. Who wrote those? Luke. Luke. The question is, well, Luke who? Who was Luke?
Physician.
A physician? Gentile? Yeah, what are some challenges in trying to figure out who wrote this book, or any book or letter in the New Testament?
They didn't sign it.
They didn't sign it. It kind of makes it difficult to figure out who wrote something if you don't put your name on your paper, right? Remember, that's what your teachers always tell you, put your name on your paper. So, especially when we're thinking about ancient writing, ancient documents, it can be challenging to figure out who wrote something. I've done a fair amount of writing because of the work that I do, and I put my name on my paper. But if you think about like 1,000 years from now, I would suggest to you that it's going to be nearly impossible to know who David Flatt was if he wrote something. You take just the bulletin. There's an article there, and it's got my name on it. You say, well, David wrote the article. So, well, prove that David wrote the article. Well, his name's there. Well, it's typed. It was electronically created. And how can you know? Who is this David Flatt? Well, there's a lot of David Flatts. I had a friend encounter this last week with somebody who knew David Flatt, thought they did. But it can be really difficult to try to figure out who actually wrote this. Especially in the Bible, there are things where the authors didn't put their name, and then some question, well, even documents that have a name, did that person actually put his name on the document? And you can go down and look into the world of translation and all that kind of thing, and it can be, for some of us it's interesting, for most people it's just dry and boring. But Luke, whoever Luke was, if you look at the facts about the author on page 5, it puts these passages in Colossians, Philemon, and 2 Timothy, where Luke is identified. We conclude that Luke was a believer. He clearly, whoever wrote this was a believer. in Jesus, that he is the Son of Man, he is the Son of God, he's the Messiah. He's a Gentile. He's a Gentile. And that's interesting. That's going to have a big effect on the perspective that is brought to this gospel. In that text in Colossians 4, there's a group of people that are mentioned, and Paul kind of divides the group up. There was a group that was of the circumcision, and there's a group that wasn't. And that tells us that, well, a group of them were Jewish, and a group of them were Gentiles. And so Luke is mentioned in the group that were Gentiles. So he is a non-Israelite. He is coming from a pagan background. A physician, the beloved physician, as Luke is referenced. So you think about Paul, whoever this Luke was, right? Luke, this man, he traveled with Paul. He's a companion of Paul. And when you think about everything Paul went through, so much of when we read about his life, we're focused just on him and how he's going through things, but he usually has others with him. Not just the people who are of the town that he was, but he has people who travel with him. Now, there's some times where he's alone, where he's separated. There are people around. And, given the persecution, the violence that he suffered, you could understand why it would be wise to have a doctor as part of your group. There's real practical reasons for that. Now, you kind of chuckle at that. In 2012, I'll tell you a true story. Come on in. Here's two seats right here. In 2012, I went with two other preachers to Sierra Leone for 3 weeks. And if you know anything about Sierra Leone, it's not a nice place. The third world. And one of the questions that I had when I was thinking about going, I looked at John Smith, the real John Smith, one of the men that I went with, and I said, John, if my appendix bursts, what happens to me? Like, you're trying to think about the worst case scenario. If I'm over here in this third world, what happens to me? He says, well, there's an embassy. The U.S. has an embassy there, and they've got an operating room in the embassy. And I said, okay. So when I got there, and we were out. It's very difficult to get around that place for a lot of reasons. But anyhow, he pointed out there's the embassy, and it was way out somewhere, and it's behind barbed wire, and you can't just go to the embassy. And so I said, well, if my appendix bursts, I'm in trouble. You're just up the creek. I say all of that to just point out it's very understandable if you could have a doctor be part of your traveling group doing something like Paul was doing. You can understand the practicality of it. But each of these traits of this man shape how he writes, what his purpose in writing is. So we know that he's a believer. So, okay, so he's gonna emphasize Jesus for all of the reasons we would expect. He's a Gentile. Well, that gets into his perspective of the gospel's for everybody. It's not just for the Jews, it's for everybody. I mean, it was for him. He wasn't part of Israel, but Jesus was for him. So you're going to find Luke showing lots of instances where Jesus is dealing with people who aren't Jewish, or people who are on the outsides or on the margins of society. The fact that he's a physician is often pointed out about the way that he's very detailed in his writing. So if you read Matthew, Matthew will tell us that Jesus healed a man who was sick. Whereas Luke might tell you, well, what the sickness was, right? Another thing about the details, you really get a sense of the details when you read Acts. I mean, Luke is as precise as he possibly can be at every turn. And there are points at which, when he's describing Paul's sailing, when he's sailing, I mean, Luke basically gives you coordinates, very precise coordinates of where he is at that point in time. So there's reasons for that. There's some reasons for that. We might get to that. So the purpose of Luke. Where would we go to find the purpose of this gospel?
Chapter 1.
Chapter
1, 2, and 3.
Okay. He makes it real easy for us, doesn't he? Right? He puts it right up front. Sometimes they'll put something right in the back. You know, it's always so a long time ago when you read a book, you should read the introduction and conclusion, and then start reading on the book, so you know what it's about, where it's going. So Luke makes it real simple for us. Although it's kind of a lengthy introduction, he says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you've been taught. So, if we unpack this a little bit, he says that many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. What's that about, do you think?
Could be referring to the account of Mark, which was supposedly the first one written.
Okay.
And
Okay.
was then in existence when Luke wrote it.
Okay. Could be talking about Mark. He's saying that there seems to be a number of other people who have written accounts about Jesus and about his ministry, so there's a lot of information that's out there, and that's a good thing. You know, when we won't talk much about canonicity and the process of all of that, but there are a lot of misconceptions about that topic and how you know the Bible came in the form that we have, and there's a lot of conspiracy and mystery associated with it, as if some group of people were in some dark room and they decided what got put in and what got left out and that sort of thing. When you actually look at what happened, there was a more natural process that the scriptures came to us in the form that we've got them. And you get a sense of it if you just read the New Testament, and Luke is a great example of it. There were lots of people writing lots of things. There was a lot that was being circulated. And as texts are being circulated, they're taken for what they are. You want to learn about Jesus? Who was he? What was he about? Well, we need to get an account about his ministry, about something like Luke, and that's how people would become believers. These texts would be used in worship, as part of worship, liturgy, and just over time, that's how the scriptures become incorporated into life and faith and the life of a church. And that might not make a really good Hollywood movie, but that's more to the way that it happened. Cindy, go ahead.
I've got a comment here at the beginning where it said the Greeks had an idea of human perfection. So him being a doctor and knowledgeable, if he's saying, I really know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. I'm not just somebody else writing something I saw. Yeah. There might be some expertise there.
Yeah, and there's something to that. He says also here about what is being written, he says, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. Where does Luke get his information? Eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses. That doesn't sound like long, long ago, far, far away, does it? Eyewitnesses. Why would that be important?
It's a first-hand account.
It's a first-hand account.
I mean, in the legal
know today, it's corroborating evidence.
Yeah, yeah, you know something about the importance of primary sources and being able to talk to the person instead of a person who knew the person, or
I don't want to talk to that person who knew him.
that's right, you want to talk to the man directly, yeah. So you're getting at the source, and for legal purposes, I think there's something to that we'll touch on in a few minutes. But between Luke's background, he just would have been detail oriented as a physician. But if there's something else in the background, there may be something else in the background as to why Luke would want to be detail oriented and get accounts from eyewitnesses for this document. Right?
And I guess this also confirms that he probably never knew Jesus, or at least he was not an eyewitness.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you say I'm one of those eyewitnesses.
Yes, he does not include himself as that in that group. He would be a secondary source, and that becomes, when you're trying to put together ancient history, a secondary source. If you don't have a primary, the secondary is, you'll take that. But he's going to the source, and that's becoming how he develops his material. So, the veracity of it can be trusted. So it seemed good, he goes, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account. He wants to write an orderly account. So it's not just some haphazard journal that he's putting together. There's thought behind it. There's a chronology to it, and the chronology is, people will debate just how precise the order is, but there's a chronology to it that he wants to include, and he writes it. He does this for most excellent Theophilus. So who is Theophilus?
Don't know much.
Don't know much.
Roman official, maybe.
Okay, we don't know much. We do know that this book is written to him, and so is Acts. Acts is written to Theophilus.
Well, we don't know who he was. Probably he was somebody who was footing the bill for them to do all the traveling. Somebody who had money and something to do this. He's like writing back to him, kind of like our preachers that we support write to us when how things are going. I think it's kind of similar to that, possibly.
It could be. It could be.
It's more than likely somebody he cared deeply about, because again, to write Luke and Acts, anytime you're writing a letter to someone, there's natural intent there. So you have to think it was somebody who was trying to reach out.
Yeah, there's some motivation. The question is, well, what is that motivation?
That he's a believer, because it talks about the things you have been taught.
Okay, it could be. That could be. Some might look at the term, and there's this perspective. Theophilus, it means friend of God, and it could just be a literary device. That Theophilus wasn't a real person. It was just this literary device that Luke uses in his writing. And I don't think that's what's going on here at all. But you may find that. There's a title that he gives them that's interesting. Most excellent. I don't refer to most people as most excellent. Do you?
Just my wife.
Just your wife? I don't believe that, but you don't refer to just anybody that way. Now in Acts, the most excellent title's dropped. It's just Theophilus, but most excellent. And again, people scratch their head and wonder, who is this guy? Is that an affectionate way to refer to him, or does it have something to do perhaps with the position that Theophilus held? And it very well could have been the position that Theophilus held.
I think most of the time, most excellent refers to like a ruler or judge or something.
That's what I think. I think somebody that was, that's how we refer to judges and magistrates. And and maybe Theophilus was a lawyer. Maybe he was a lawyer. That could be the case. Pardon the pun. But we'll try to put some more pieces together here in just a second.
David,
Go ahead.
you know, and another thought too is, not on Theophilus, but just on Luke, is he obviously wasn't fighting, because Paul says in Timothy, I believe, quoting Luke, saying, this is scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, and also, we gotta trust that God preserved this writings, which would be inspired writings.
Mm-hmm.
So, somehow, of course, God was able to use these men and their personality, but still, it's inspired.
Yeah, that's is it 1 Timothy 5:18, I think is where, 18 or 8, I forget which, but it's just this little phrase that as he quotes from the Old Testament, but the phrase that he adds doesn't come from the Old Testament; it comes from Luke, and that can even be more an indication about how things are circulated and become incorporated into how people would talk about Jesus. So yeah, Paul would quote from Luke's writing. Anything else about this introduction?
Okay, we know it. The book was written like while he was traveling with Paul or after Paul, or do we know what timeline?
We're getting there.
Okay.
We're getting there. Yeah. So he wants him to have certainty. So certainty in the things that he'd been taught, certainty in the things he'd been instructed in. He could have been a believer, and I think that's the way our eyes and ears are accustomed to reading a text like that. This could be that he's heard some things. And is what he heard accurate? Is it true? I mean, what Luke has described here is I want to give you a trustworthy account that's coming from eyewitnesses, so you can have trust in what it is that you have heard to this point. So some features of the gospel. Well, we'll come back to make some connections, hopefully, with this introduction here in just a minute. But some features of the Gospel of Luke. So we said that it's written by a Gentile to a Gentile, and that's important in terms of we're expanding the scope of who Jesus came for. We think that Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, and there's reason for that. We can get into all of that. This is slightly different than that, right? Because Paul was a Jew who goes to the Gentiles. Here you have a Gentile writing to a Gentile. So that can be very helpful and persuasive to somebody who's coming from a Gentile background. That here's an account for Jesus. We can see things in a relatable way. Another interesting thing here is in terms of the genealogy of the 3rd chapter, I think it is, traces the genealogy of Jesus to Adam. What's the big deal?
Being Gentile, he wasn't going to get the tree from Abraham.
Yeah, that's great that he could trace it to Abraham, but what's that to me? I can't trace myself to Abraham, but I can to Adam. Again, this is getting into his perspective that Jesus is for everyone. He's for everyone. So that's why you find him going back to Adam. And then, right after that, is where the ministry of Jesus starts to begin. You start seeing him going to everyone. This is how Luke frames up the book. All the Old Testament citations, we don't know, we wouldn't recognize this just reading through our translation, but all the Old Testament citations in this book come from the Septuagint. A Septuagint version of the Bible was the Greek version of the Old Testament, and that was the popular version of the time. Luke doesn't know Hebrew. Luke doesn't have a reason to know. I don't know Hebrew. Right? I use an English version of the Bible, and well, that's sort of what Luke was doing. The Septuagint is that's the language of, well, the Gentiles, perhaps, that he would be trying to read. That's the language of Theophilus. So that's one of the distinguishing features of Luke. Different story when you look at some of the other Gospels. And then it also includes a number of prayers and miracles of Jesus. Jesus is noted prominently praying in Luke. And not just Jesus, but prayer in general is used quite a lot by Luke in the Gospel and in Acts. I think I wrote it down here, in 19 times prayer is mentioned in Luke, and 16 times it's mentioned in Acts. What's Luke trying to tell us about prayer? There are a lot of things that Luke might not have been. He might not have been a Jew. He might not have been an eyewitness. He might not have been an apostle. But he was a believer who had faith in prayer. And now there's something that you and I can connect to. That Luke is an integral part of the ministry of Paul, and in prayer becoming a very important aspect of that as far as Luke was concerned. If we think about some of the themes that we'll find here, there's a lot of different themes, and there's some that are included here in the book. Here's a list of what I've put together, and these are what you'll find anywhere, anybody writing about the themes of this text. We've talked about how salvation is for everyone, is the primary theme. The humanity of Jesus, we've touched on that a little bit. The humanity of Jesus is identified, the Son of Man. I'll give you this word of caution about the humanity of Jesus. It seems that we emphasize that, and for good reasons. We're humans, and the Bible makes that point, how he understands us because he was one of us. And that's fine. That's important and helpful to a point. Jesus is more than human. And Jesus didn't come here to show us he was human. Luke isn't trying to show us, hey, Jesus is human. Jesus once told the disciples that I am from above, you are from beneath. And in the tendency that happens subtly over time when we pay so much attention to the humanity of Jesus and talking about the compassion, how we can relate to him, is we ignore his divinity. And that's not why his humanity is expressed. Right? His humanity is expressed to impact us to know that the divine inhabited flesh, that the divine lived among us. That speaks to the love of God. That speaks to the power of God. That speaks to the power of Jesus. Yes, Jesus is our friend, but Jesus is also our King. And there is a reverent approach that we've got to make toward him. Jesus is not one of the guys. And there's a lot of people who do what I do for a living, who make it sound like Jesus is just one of the guys. And that's not true. And that's not how he's presented in the Scriptures. It also shows the compassion for the marginalized. You've probably read about how in Luke, Jesus emphasizes the poor. The poor. And, when we think of the poor, there's an image that we have in our mind as, somebody who doesn't have money. And that's true. But the poor is, nobody had money in the ancient world, right? You say everybody was poor economically. So the poor, as far as Jesus is concerned, is not just economic status. The poor is about people who are marginalized, who the rest of the community has just pushed out for various reasons. So you'll find Jesus dealing with those kinds of people, that he has compassion, he pays attention, he sees them. And there's a lot of emphasis in this text, I think, that Luke is showing us that he wants his readers to see the crowds the way Jesus sees the crowds, and developing a compassionate heart to bring healing, to bring salvation to those that the world has no regard for. The work of the Spirit is also emphasized in Luke and especially in Acts, but his role, his work is described, featured somewhat in Acts. And then this is true in all the Gospels, really, about this upside down kingdom. So there's paradoxes that are used, and to show us that the kingdom is not what you think. It's not what you think. Everybody thinks we've got it all figured out. Everybody thinks we know who Jesus is and what he's about. And Jesus is all the time saying, no, it's not what you think. It's not what you think. If you want to be rich, you've got to be poor. That kind of thing, right? If you want to be great, you've got to be small. And that's not just some trick of a public speaker. He's trying to emphasize the kind of heart that's necessary, the kind of heart the kingdom is all about. So some of the themes. A little bit about the structure of Luke. I want to point out here, Luke is a big book, and anytime you've got a lengthy book, I mean any book of the Bible you look at, you want to understand the flow of thought as best you can. And when you get into a lengthy text like this, it can be helpful to break things down into more manageable sections. And everybody has their own way with Luke, I think, of kind of dividing things up. 4 sections to me, is a whole lot easier than 8 sections. So you've got his pre-ministry in the first 3 chapters. So you've got the birth accounts of John and of Jesus. That genealogy is given, and we learn about what's coming. Now, Luke we learn about what's coming. In chapter 4 to verse 56 of chapter 9 describe really what we would think about his popular ministry. I mean, there's a time where Jesus he's famous, right? You've got people from all surrounding areas who've heard something about him, and they want to see what he's all about. Hey, we've heard he can heal the sick. Well, I'm sick. I'm pretty desperate. I'm going to go see if this guy can help me. And if you think his healing is something, you ought to listen to what he teaches. He doesn't sound like all the teachers that we know. He doesn't sound like the elite. He's different. He's worth the travel to go see him. And so there's this time where his ministry is very popular. And again, it's Jesus is dealing with sick people, with broken people. He's casting out demons during that time. And the other thing that is happening throughout Luke, and maybe to the chronology that you see, that's often pointed out in his travels, is he's making his way to Jerusalem. Right? We know where all of this is headed. Right? This is ultimately heading to Jerusalem, to the cross, and so that's going to be the dynamic of his ministry. The Berean ministry is described beginning in verse 57 of chapter 9 through verse 27 of chapter 19. And a little bit about the geography of Perea. A lot of people would go to that area to get out of the colder weather. When it rains and it gets cool and damp. Imagine living in a stone house, stone structures, and just, I lived in Houston for 6 years in the wintertime. It doesn't get that cold. In the 40s with rain, and you just never can get warm. And people would travel to Perea to kind of get out of some of that. It was a nicer place, and so you've got a lot of people down in Perea. I heard somebody say, "Oh, Perea was like Florida, our Florida, the snowbirds go to find better weather." And so again, you have a lot of people there, and they're, you know, they would have been interested to hear about it, especially given, you know, what had already been going on through his ministry to that point. And then the parting ministry, which is about this triumphant entry into Jerusalem, his trial, crucifixion, and his resurrection. There's more details we could put in with this structure, but it can be helpful to kind of see the dynamic and the flow of thought. So, what does Luke want Theophilus to know about Jesus? You think back to that introduction. You know, what does he want us to know? And when you read Luke, this is the question that you need to ask. What is he trying to tell us? What is, you know, how would Theophilus have taken this? Anytime we study the scriptures, we need to be getting back to the original intent. What did the author have in mind? How would the recipient have understood this text? So, what Luke wants Theophilus to know about Jesus, he wants him to know that Jesus was a man who knew he was God. Jesus was a man who knew he was God. That's a more accurate way to explain the humanity of Jesus. Now, he was human, but he knew who he was. He was more than just a man. A man who knew he was God. Jesus was not a political revolutionary. Now, there's a perspective on Luke that, you know, Luke was with Paul when Paul was either in Caesarea or in Rome. When Paul was in prison, Luke was with him. And the thinking is that this could have been written for Theophilus, who might have been Paul's lawyer. There's all kinds of accusations made against Paul, mainly the accusation that's made time and again in the book of Acts against all the Christians, is that they don't say that Caesar is king. You know, they're threatening revolution. They say there's another king, that Jesus is king, and that's not at all what Luke shows in Luke and in Acts. Jesus was not a political revolutionary, and if you read these documents with that perspective in mind, I think there's something to be said for it. He showed that, you know, Jesus wasn't a threat. This is really all of the arguments that's going on with the establishment within the Jews is all about the resurrection, and these are just internal debates. That all of the accusations that have been made against Paul, it's not true. It's not what happened. There's eyewitness testimony. You might have heard some things, you know, at the end of that verse 4 in chapter 1, things that you've heard. It says, here's an accurate account of what actually happened, what has really gone on concerning Jesus, and then with Paul in the book of Acts. So, also, he wants Theophilus to know, perhaps, that Jesus looked for the marginalized, as they are emphasized in the text, and that Jesus is the Savior of everyone. So Luke becomes very, very important for us to understand these points. You know, we hear this: Jesus was a man who knew he was God. That shapes how we look at Jesus. He wasn't a political revolutionary. Oh my. We think, oh, we don't, you know, that has nothing to do with us now. But look at the way Jesus has been attached to politics. Jesus his mission and purpose has been twisted and warped every which way but loose. And we need to probably get back to looking at those kingdom paradoxes to understand what he really is about, what he's really seeking to do. Jesus looks for the marginalized. That's important in shaping our perspective of our neighbor, our fellow man, and how we are to treat them. You know, we love God with all of our heart and our neighbor as ourselves. It's basic and fundamental. Always has been and always will be, to to someone who's trying to be a child of God. And Jesus being the Savior of anyone means, you know, sharing His Word. You can share in His Word and lead others to Christ. Appreciate you being here today. We'll pick up with these birth accounts of Jesus on Wednesday. Thank you.
Somebody's praying against police
That's right.
Yeah, Louise.
That's the least worry.
Exactly. Consider the source. Feel better? Good, good.
I'm not sure what right. Yeah. You know, but I can talk about that well. Yeah. The right time and the right. And then sometimes it's like the rest. Yeah. You knew, you know. I know. That was a crazy thing. Yeah. Well, all right.
Now, you better share with us the graduation announcement.
I will.
We gotta give this boy some senior love, okay?
Absolutely.
I mean that, you better. Okay. Show me senior pictures and all that. I know, it's early, but.